King Arthur, the noble king of Camelot, wielder of Excalibur, leader of the legendary Knights of the Round Table. We all know the story. It's one of honor, magic, and destiny. For centuries, it's been a shining beacon of chivalry from a lost age of heroes. But what if I told you that almost everything you know about him is a lie? The shining armor, the romantic court, even Camelot itself, all added much, much later. For centuries, the truth of King Arthur has been buried under layers of myth and legend. But if you dig deep into the earliest records, a few cryptic clues point to a single real-life warrior. In this video, we're stripping away the fiction to reveal the shocking identity of the one man who could have been the real King Arthur. The legend we all know. When you think of King Arthur, a very specific image probably comes to mind. A wise and just king in the idyllic castle of Camelot, surrounded by his loyal knights of the Round Table. We think of his magical sword, Excalibur, a gift from the mystical Lady of the Lake. We remember the drama of his romance with Queen Guinevere, her tragic affair with Sir Lancelot, and, of course, the epic quest for the Holy Grail. This is the Arthur of storybooks and blockbuster movies. It's an incredible story, full of romance, heroism, and tragedy. But here's the thing, it's not history. This version of the story was largely created and popularized in the 12th century by a cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth in his book, The History of the Kings of Britain. He took a few scattered Welsh legends and spun them into a grand, sweeping epic, turning Arthur from a simple warrior into a mighty king who conquered half of Europe. A bit later, French writers added the romantic flair we all know: Lancelot, the courtly love, the Grail quest. Each generation tacked on a new layer, creating a hero that reflected their own ideals. The problem? Geoffrey was writing over 600 years after Arthur was supposed to have lived. His work is more historical fiction than fact. So if the legend isn't true, what is? To find the real Arthur, we have to strip away centuries of myth. We have to leave the shining towers of Camelot behind and travel back to a much darker, more violent time. The chaotic world of post-Roman Britain. A king in the shadows. To find Arthur, first you have to understand his world. Picture Britain around the year 400. For nearly 4 centuries it was a province of the Roman Empire, with roads, cities and legions. Then, in 410, Rome fell and the legions were recalled to defend the heart of the empire. Britain was left to fend for itself. What followed was a century of chaos. Roman society crumbled, warlords carved out petty kingdoms from the ruins, and from across the sea came new invaders, the Angles, Saxons and Jutes. Historians once called these the Dark Ages, and for good reason. It was an era of fire and sword. This is the brutal, desperate world where the real Arthur would have lived. He wouldn't have been a king in a fancy court, he'd have been a warrior fighting for the survival of his people. Now you'd think a figure this important would be all over the writings of his time. But there's only one major historical source from that era. A fiery sermon written by a British monk named Gildas around the year 540. His work, On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain, is a first-hand account of the chaos and the Saxon invasions. Gildas describes a pivotal moment. A huge victory won by the Britons against the Saxons at a place called the Mount of Badon. This battle was so decisive it stopped the Saxon advance for a whole generation. And it's the very same battle that later legends would call Arthur's greatest triumph. But here's the single most baffling piece of the puzzle. Gildas, writing within living memory of this epic battle, never once mentions the name Arthur. Not once. He gives the credit for the victory to a different man, a Romano-British leader named Ambrosius Aurelianus. Why would the only contemporary writer of the age completely leave out the hero supposedly responsible for the greatest victory of the era? It's a gaping hole in the historical record. For a long time, this silence led many historians to believe Arthur was a total fabrication. But the story isn't quite that simple. The first whispers of a name. While Arthur is missing from the one contemporary account, his name does start to pop up in the centuries that follow. These aren't exactly history books, but they're the first clues in our investigation. The earliest potential trace appears in a Welsh poem called Y Gododin, which might have been composed as early as the 7th century. In it, the poet praises a fallen warrior by saying he was great, but he was no Arthur. This one line is huge. It suggests that by this time the name Arthur was already the gold standard for heroism. The only catch is that many scholars believe this line might be a later addition, inserted into the poem centuries after it was first written. The first time we see Arthur jump from poetry into a more historical text is around the year 828 in a work called the Historia Brittonum, or the History of the Britons. The author, a Welsh monk named Nennius, paints a startlingly different picture of Arthur. He is not a king. The text is very specific, calling him a dux bellorum, a Latin term meaning war leader or commander of battles. Nennius lists 12 battles that this Arthur supposedly fought against the Saxons. The list is poetic and hard to pin down geographically, but it ends with the most important victory, the Battle of Baden, where Nennius claims Arthur single-handedly killed 960 men. Finally, a direct link between a man named Arthur and the historical Battle of Baden. But we have to be careful. The Historia Brittonum was written 300 years after the events it describes and is a known jumble of folklore and propaganda. About a century later, another Welsh text, the Annales Cambriae or Welsh Annals, adds two more crucial entries. For the year 516 it records the Battle of Baden, in which Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ on his shoulders, and the Britons were the victors. Then, for the year 537, it states, the strife of Camlan, in which Arthur and Medrawt fell. This is the first mention of Arthur's final battle, Camlan, and his famous adversary, later known as Mordred. But again, these annals were compiled centuries after the fact, and scholars still debate how reliable these entries are. So where does that leave us? We've gone from a complete lack of evidence in Arthur's own time to a few fragmented, cryptic mentions in later Welsh texts. These sources seem to agree on one thing. Arthur was a warrior, a leader of the Britons who won a great victory at Baden. The king in shining armour is still a myth, but the war leader, he might just be real. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's greatest mysteries, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We have a lot more legends to unmask, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. The lineup of suspects. If the historical Arthur wasn't the king of legend, then who was he? Who was the real man behind the myth? Over the years, historians have pieced together the clues and identified several possible candidates. It's time to look at the lineup of suspects. First up is a popular but unlikely candidate, Lucius Artorius Castus. He was a Roman officer who served in Britain back in the 2nd century. His name is obviously very similar to Arthur, and he commanded cavalry, which fits the later image of knights. This theory was even the basis for the 2004 movie King Arthur. The problem? The timeline is all wrong. Castus lived and died a full 300 years before the Battle of Baden. So while the name is intriguing, he simply can't be our man. Our second suspect is a much stronger contender, Ambrosius Aurelianus. Remember him? He's the man the monk Gildas actually credited with leading the Britons to victory at Baden. Gildas describes him as a man of noble Roman descent, whose parents had worn the purple, meaning they were likely from the ruling class. He rallied the Britons and led them against the Saxons, so he perfectly fits the description of a Romano-British leader. So where does Arthur fit in? One theory is that Arthur was a nickname. Some have speculated it could have meant the bear in Celtic, a common name for a fierce warrior. Though this is just a theory, it's possible Ambrosius Aurelianus was the man later known as Arthur. Or maybe Arthur was his top general, a brilliant commander whose fame on the battlefield eventually eclipsed that of his leader. Our third suspect is maybe the most tantalizing of all, a figure known as Riothemus. This name is actually a title meaning High King or Supreme King. Around the year 470, this Riothemus led a large army of Britons across the English Channel into Gaul, modern-day France, to help the Roman Emperor fight the Visigoths. His story has eerie parallels to the legends written by Geoffrey of Monmouth, which also describe Arthur campaigning on the continent. Tragically, Riothemus was betrayed by a Roman official, his army was defeated, and he retreated into Burgundy, vanishing from history. A British king leading an army in Europe who is betrayed and then disappears? The similarities are hard to ignore, but the most widely accepted theory among modern historians isn't about a single person. The shocking identity of King Arthur may be that he wasn't one man, but a composite figure. The legend of Arthur may be a tapestry woven from the threads of many lives. The leadership of Ambrosius, the European campaign of Reothamus, and the battlefield skill of a dozen other forgotten warlords. At the core of it all, though, there was almost certainly a real warrior. The memory of the victory at Baden was too strong, and the name Arthur echoed too powerfully in Welsh tradition for it to be pure fiction. The most likely reality is this. Sometime in the late 5th or early 6th century, a Romano-British commander, whose real name might be lost to us, managed to unite the fractured British tribes. He was a product of his time, ruthless, pragmatic, and an expert in the guerrilla warfare of a collapsing world. He wasn't a king, but a dux bellorum, a warlord. And he won a victory so important it bought his people a generation of peace. His name, or perhaps his title, was Arthur. That is the shocking identity. Not a fantasy king, but a desperate warrior fighting in the ruins of civilization. From warlord to legend. So how did this gritty, desperate warlord become the shining example of chivalry we know today? The journey from a 6th century battlefield to the gleaming halls of Camelot is a masterclass in how legends are made. After the peace won at Baden eventually failed, the Britons were pushed back into the west and north, into what we now know as Wales, Cornwall and Scotland. For these defeated people, the memory of their last great hero became a powerful symbol of defiance and hope for a future saviour. The story of Arthur was kept alive not by historians but by bards, the poets and storytellers in the Welsh courts. For centuries, they told his tale around campfires and in mead halls, and with every telling, the story grew. The warlord's victories became more miraculous. His followers became more heroic. Magical elements pulled from older Celtic mythology were woven into the story. This was a living, breathing oral tradition that grew and changed over time. Then, in 1136, Geoffrey of Monmouth collected these heroic tales and, using a healthy dose of his own imagination, wrote his History of the Kings of Britain. Writing for a new Norman ruling class, he transformed the Welsh folk hero into a king who could rival Charlemagne. He gave Arthur a grand family tree, a powerful kingdom called Camelot, and a continental empire. He made Arthur a hero for all of Britain, not just the Welsh. A few decades later, French poets like Chrétien de Troyes got their hands on the story. They weren't interested in a warrior king. They were interested in the ideals of their own time, chivalry and courtly love. So they added some of the most famous parts of the legend. They created Sir Lancelot, the perfect knight. They invented his passionate, forbidden love for Queen Guinevere. And they introduced the spiritual quest for the Holy Grail. The gritty British warlord was now a romantic French hero. The legend was complete. So we've journeyed from the romantic myth of Camelot all the way back to the harsh reality of the Dark Ages. We've sifted through the evidence, from the damning silence of contemporary writers to the first cryptic whispers of a hero's name. And we've arrived at a conclusion. Was there a real King Arthur? The answer is almost certainly no. There was no Camelot, no Round Table, no Excalibur pulled from a stone. These are the beautiful, enduring fictions of a later age. But was there a real Arthur? The answer to that is very likely yes. He wasn't a king, but a Romano-British war leader, a dux bellorum who fought for the survival of his people in a collapsing world. We may never know his real name, or which of the candidates, Ambrosius, Reothamus, or some other forgotten hero, formed the core of his story. He remains a tantalizing phantom of history, glimpsed only in the fragments of his own legend. The real Arthur was a figure far grittier and in many ways more heroic than the sanitized king of the stories. He was a symbol of resistance in a time of utter despair, and his victory at Baden was so profound it echoed through the centuries, creating a legend that has far outlasted any real kingdom. In the end, the search for the historical Arthur reveals a greater truth. Sometimes a story is more powerful than any single person. the legend became more important than the man ever was. A timeless tale of hope in the darkness. So what do you think? Who was the real Arthur? Let us know your theory in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the past.